Ohayo gozaimasu, or actually at this day it's probably more like konbanwa gozaimasu. Howdy, I'm Jammer, and that introduction will come to sort of mean something here in a minute. But first, forewarning, the following comic book review will involve spoilers for the graphic novel Watchmen. If you haven't read this book yet, what are you doing? Seriously, just come on. Anyway, if you haven't read this book yet, but you have every intention to do so and you don't want spoilers, go ahead and stop this video now. We'll wait. Okay, they're gone. Oh, hold on a minute. He hasn't read it yet. Anyway, if you've ever read Watchmen, and if you're watching this right now, I assume you are, the ending works that the character, superhero Ozymandias, has effectively bombed New York, but bomb is kind of a misnomer. What he's done is essentially created a synthetic organism that looks like a gigantic octopus vagina monster and dropped it on New York using advanced sci-fi technology. You don't need to know all the details. This kills hundreds of thousands of individuals and effectively ends the impending nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union. At the very end of the book, the other superheroes in the graphic novel confront Ozymandias, and he turns on his wall of television sets to observe the after effects of his accomplishment. And the reader is given this page right here. You see the news coming out, we see Ozymandias tearing up, and then we see right here. What does he say? No, seriously, this isn't like rhetorical. What does he say? We'll get back to that. But on the note of that question, we also have to talk a little bit about these two right here. Is there a difference between this symbol and this one? Yes, visually, but at its core, no. This is also something that we're going to talk to a little bit later. Because, as this sort of convoluted opening begins, we are going to continue the chapter-by-chapter review of Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics. Sorry, there's thunder going on in the background. You may be able to hear it, probably not, but I just heard it and my dogs are probably going to start freaking out. Anyway, we are continuing with Understanding Comics. We're specifically going to get into Chapter 6, which is Show and Tell. Now again, if you haven't been following the series up to this point, we have to remember comics is understood basically as sequential art, but McCloud's definition is juxtaposed pictorial images in a deliberate sequence. Now, at first, that's predominantly this right here. We have a gentleman, he's wearing his hat, and then he takes the hat off. We have this gutter here between these two panels to show that time has taken place, and though we may not watch the hat come off, we generally understand that it has. At that moment, we take visual cues to understand something is happening here. And McCloud brings something really important when he, in this very first chapter, because when he talks about words and the opening, or when he talks about this definition, there's a small little panel here which briefly discusses this idea, which is the idea that, technically speaking, words are pictures arranged in a deliberate sequence. The same way we talk about film. That's, technically speaking, images placed in a deliberate sequence. The only thing that separates film from comics, or abstract prose from comics, is that comics implies both words and pictures. So, let's go back to Mr. Ozymandias here and see again, what did he actually say? What he said was, I did it. Now, again, I covered that up for a reason, because even if you haven't read this book, and I told you I was going to give away spoilers, shame on you. Even if you haven't read this book, you probably have a good idea what Ozymandias was saying just looking at that panel, because even if you don't have the frame of context for it, the pose of, well, you can't see my hands because I'm Ichabod Crane and very long and gangly, but you understand what that means, because you exist in a culture where, while we have words to convey emotions, ideas, we also have physical gestures. And physical gestures are very much a part of language as much as images are. So chapter 6, this long explanation, has just kind of demonstrated is we're going to be predominantly focusing on how comics balances the use of abstract language with sort of visual language, and then combines the two to create a language of its own. So, with that in hand, let's get started. Okay, now, don't give me that look, okay? If you really wanted to know how the book ends, you should have taken the time to sit down and actually read it. You're sitting here alone on my desk all day. What are you doing? He can conquer the known world, but he can't find 5 minutes to read a comic book. Just saying. Anyway, again, we're discussing the notion of language in comics, and as I used the example earlier of these two images right here, we have to understand and remember that our words and our language are effectively images. We employ them to create language. Again, this is the letter A, which is one of the fundamental units for the language of English. This is A, and this specifically is hiragana, Japanese script. A friend of mine was teaching me Japanese, that's why I opened it up with Ohayou gozaimasu. Thank you, sensei. Anyway, one of the interesting things about Chapter 6 is the way Scott McCloud tackles the notion of how comics has effectively sort of created their own language. I'm going to move you over just a little bit. Thank you. One of the things he points out in his book is how we as a culture and as a society, go ahead and pause your screen real quick so that I can stop holding this up. I'll give you a second. Okay. In that small text, he's really able to demonstrate that in our society, there really is a bias against the inclusion of words and images at the same time. Occasionally, they can intermix. An example of this is probably picture books. If you take, say, Instructions by Neil Gaiman, it's a format most people recognize. We have pictures and we have words together, but the understanding is this is a picture book. That means it's just for children. It's not designed for more, air quote, adult reading. Likewise, when we read books like he points out there, The Hobbit. If you've ever read The Hobbit, there are various, depending on the edition that you get, there will be various illustrations that Tolkien did, say, of Smaug, Lake Town, the Lonely Mountain, eagles, what have you. At that point, the reader is still considered a child, and so a couple of images here and there are perfectly fine and acceptable. But the moment an adult picks up in a book, the understanding, of course, is, oh, well, you know, if there's any pictures whatsoever, it's not really a book intended for adults. This, Scott McCloud points out, and I would argue as well, is kind of bullshit. And though he also points out in that structure as well, as unfortunately sometimes people don't read books at all, which is very unfortunate because books kick ass. Like, yeah. But when we consider the notion of images and language working together simultaneously, it's a dubious prospect because, again, we're reinforced this notion that this can only exist alongside other letters. If I incorporated the letter A next to an image of a face, at that moment, the intellectual level of the reader is assumed to be next to nil. That is more or less a fundamental understanding or a popular understanding of why comics has traditionally been kind of pushed to the edges of more, air quote, legitimate media studies. Image and word together indicates a lack of intelligence. But as he's wont to do, Scott McCloud really effectively points that out when he says, in a way, pictures and words had reached the end of a 5,000-year journey. They were to continue moving. Where could they go? For pictures, there was only up. Impressionism sent the Western art towards the abstract vertex, but in a way that clung to what the eye saw. Impressionism, while it could be thought of as the first modern movement, was more a culmination of the old, the ultimate study of light and color. Soon after came the explosion: Expressionism, Futurism, Dadaism, Surrealism, Fauvism, Cubism, Abstract Expressionism, Neoplasticism, Constructivism, blah, blah, blah. There's a lot of art movements. I included this passage in here because, again, he employs that pyramid, or basically just the triangle structure. Again, over here we have solid, realistic pictures. Up at the top we have almost just pure abstract ideas. And then over here on the far side, we have what's kind of words. At that moment, we're talking about abstract representations of sound. So he brings up this notion of the visual language of the arts to show that even in terms of abstract representations, our understanding of what is art has shifted over time. If you look at, say, a sculpture of maybe, say, a Greek conqueror, as opposed to, say, a representation of a human being in this 20th century, you're going to get very dramatically different representations because attitudes, paradigms, philosophies, all these little rules and ideas and just sort of bleh that govern our appreciation of art changes over time. So this passage is important because it's an opportunity to reflect on a more commonly accepted mode of art and then also just sort of observe how it has changed. Because as he points out with the Dadaists, if you're not really aware of the Dada movement, I'm not going to try to sit down and explain it. It's really too long and complicated. Literally just go to the Wikipedia page for Dadaism because one, Wikipedia is actually becoming a pretty reliable source. Librarians are actually working to make it a reliable source now. And then also two, Dadaism is just actually really interesting. You should definitely look it up. But anyway, he points out that the Dada movement wasn't just necessarily a literary or artistic movement. It was this moment where people began to experiment with the idea that images, particularly letters and numbers, could be pictures alongside, say, representations of the human body. Again, this is important because language ultimately is a technology. It's the means by which we take all of these thoughts and ideas and opinions and belief and arguments and turn them effectively into something real and concrete. I can think the letter A all day, and I can visualize it in my head. But by using this symbol right here, I can convey to you the letter A. The question then becomes is, does every single representation of that idea have to be the same? Or do I have to only employ the letter A to go, ah? This is the heart of what McCloud is trying to get across. Because as he pointed out in a later example, artists would also play with this idea as well. The famous painting of the pipe that says this is not a pipe. It's not a painting of a pipe. Or technically speaking, the image says, this is a pipe. It's not. It's a picture of a pipe. And again, it's also not because this is a picture of a pipe that isn't actually a pipe. It's a series of words and letters. Comics, as a medium, is unique because it employs visual cues alongside actual pictures and actual words to tell stories, to convey ideas and information. That's what makes it so dramatically different than just, say, art. Looking at this, you have an understanding that this is Alexander, or this is some old dead white dude who probably was in the military based upon his armor, his physical form, what have you. But if I place the word Alexander next to him, Scott McCloud is effectively arguing there, what I'm doing is effectively creating a new medium or experimenting with the means of expression because I've combined abstract symbols with concrete reality. Okay, that's a lot. So what immediate relevance does this have upon the viewer? Whereas he points out in this passage here, and again, as always, go ahead, pause the screen, and read it real quick. I'll wait. You done? All right. In case you didn't read it, I'll read it. He notes that words and pictures in combination may not be my definition of comics, but the combination has had tremendous influence on its growth. A huge range of human experiences can be portrayed in comics through either words or pictures. As a result, and despite its many other potential uses, comics have become firmly identified with the art of storytelling. And indeed, words and pictures have great powers to tell stories when creators fully exploit them for both, and so far, we've only seen the tip of the iceberg. That's his sort of way of observing that because comics is still widely regarded as a relatively new medium, there aren't that many rules of what exactly is the defined language of comics, and how do we firmly define the difference between commercial, abstract art. Now, I would argue things are dramatically changing. This book did come out well over a decade ago, so some things have most definitely changed. Nevertheless, it does allow us to sort of contemplate the fact of what are the avenues we have for all these different genres contained within the medium of art, and how do we use the language of comics in order to tell our stories. And that also begs the question of, do we even use this medium just to tell stories? Or do we also use it to express ideas and information? Well, that's actually kind of why I'm going to take a small break here and sort of elaborate on this point a little further. All right. He's pouting. So, this notion of the idea that comics might have its own sort of independent language, in the way that it uses the form as a means of expression, in terms of expressing ideas, emotions, opinion, narrative points, what have you, is something that's really worth our time and understanding, because whether you're a comics creator, a fan of the medium, or somebody who just appreciates the structure of stories, or even just the structure of the medium of comics, this is a really vital idea to discuss. So I wanted to walk through or demonstrate a couple of examples to sort of build on McCloud's argument here. The first one I'm going to cover is The Complete Cake Comics by an artist by the name of Tom of Finland. Now, I'm not going to be able to show you all of these because Tom of Finland, fun fact, is one of the fathers of the gay pornographic movement. And these comics, which I would argue that they are one, which is kind of a controversial opinion, and hopefully I'll get to his book one day soon. But this collection of comics is really important to discuss because it's an instance in which we see a lot of nonverbal communication. Tom, or by the name, his original name, Tuukko Laukkosen, was fond of saying, a stiff penis is universal in every language, or overcomes every language. I've completely butchered the quote. Basically what he was saying is, you don't really need to hear the words, "you're hot," in order to see and recognize somebody saying, I think you're fine. An excellent example of that is the comics themselves. I had to look long and hard to this book to find two pages, or two synchronous pages, that do not have just frank depictions of sex. Now, if that's your thing, definitely check this book out. But these two pages, these two panels effectively, are a really good way of demonstrating the language of comics, because we can clearly see Cake we can clearly see Cake observing the soldier, and even if we don't have word balloons or thought balloons or even just a sort of exclamation point above Cake's head, we can more or less determine what is going through his head. He's looking at the soldier, he's looking at the soldier's butt, and he's thinking to himself, oh my. At that moment, using the panel layout and the fact that we watch Cake, who's just standing on the train depot, to suddenly being in the train, we can clearly follow then that attraction is taking place. We didn't have any words, but the visual language, the unspoken language, is more or less conveyed to us. Now, I also mentioned that nonfiction comics, expressing ideas, opinions, or thoughts, can also be really beneficial in terms of this combination of pictures and words. Probably a really excellent example of is this book here, On the Origin of Species by Charles Darwin. This is a graphic novelization of Charles Darwin's canonical scientific work, and perhaps one of the most beautiful pages is where the small page title is effectively Cell-Making Instinct of the Hive Bee. You don't have to read all the words to understand what's taking place here. More or less, Charles Darwin is examining the structure of beehives and sort of marveling at the fact that bees don't have to communicate verbally the way human beings do. Bees, beans, bees, beans. Say that 5 times fast. Bees don't require our sort of similar language in order to create these complex structures of hives. Nevertheless, they do, demonstrating an immense level of intelligence. But the words alongside these images follow an intellectual argument. So while we have this really interesting visuals, we also have Darwin's actual writing to sort of build the argument or the idea. This really, or at least in my opinion, this book goes a long way towards building the notion that you can express ideas not solely through the traditional essay format that we're common of in terms of prose. Likewise, in terms of film, we may not need... I'm sorry, my phone decided to give me a small message right at that immediate moment. Blech. What I'm trying to say is words and pictures can help intellectual arguments, and perhaps another wonderful example of that is Queer, A Graphic History. This is literally a graphic novel which follows the queer movement, queer identity, politics, LGBTQ plus individuals overall, and it follows history, intellectual arguments, what have you. This is a really interesting book that employs pictures as well as words to convey its ideas. Likewise, if we go back one more time, well, I'm sorry, read it, okay? To just this page here. We have all of these word balloons, and it all sort of culminates in the I did it. Again, the panels and the images contained in the panels move the story along narratively speaking. And while the visuals are there, the body language of the individuals are there, the words contribute to a notion of the realization that then culminates with Ozymandias shedding his tears and declaring himself, basically, I did it. I won. There's also, of course, the background material of the famous image of Alexander the Great after he sliced the Gordian knot, basically the most impossible challenge of the ancient world. So again, you have all these cues working together to build the language expressed. So really, these examples are just to really reinforce the focus of Chapter 6, and arguably, again, the entire book, which is that comics is unique for the fact it employs words and images, but it doesn't necessarily prioritize one over the other. There are some graphic novels, like Frank by Jim Woodring, which are unique for the fact that they have absolutely no word balloons to speak of. They tell a story non-verbally. And even if there are no word balloons, we still understand how important the language of the structure is. So, Chapter 6 is a really interesting chapter to me for the way it explores the notion that language and image are not incompatible ideas. They may seem to be so from afar, but if we really take a look at what is taking place, at the end of the day, this is art. This is a medium. And the function of arts and medium is to convey some manner of information. And that is the key. And with that, I think I don't have too much more to say, but let me pause it, and then I'll be right back. Okay, so there actually was one last little thing to really bring up, and that's these two pages here. We get McCloud offering... Oh, I still have a couple books right over here in front. Really should have prepared before I started that up again. Anyway, Scott McCloud takes us through about 6 different means by which comics creators have employed words and images alongside each other to create specific effects in the viewer. So the first one here, he observes, is very word-specific. These are instances where words basically are enhancing the image, and the image likewise is enhancing the words. Next one, picture-specific. This one, words and pictures are kind of there presently together, but at the same time, they're not, or pictures are not really reliant that much on the words itself. Likewise, duo-specific. This is again an instance where words and ideas are more or less doing the same thing in the same panel, so you really could just use one or the other. If you ever read a lot of early comics from, like, say, the 60s or so, especially Jack Kirby's comics, this happens all the time. The Thing or Orion will swing a punch, and the person he's trying to hit will dodge it, and the person who dodged the hit will go, ha! I dodged the punch. Darn, he dodged my punch. And you're kind of like, I have eyes. I can see that. The next one is sort of additive combination, as he says, where words amplify or elaborate on an image, vice versa. So we have an image, but words give us some sort of amplification. They help us really comprehend the image that we're seeing. The next one, parallel combinations. Words and pictures seem to follow very different courses without intersecting. You've probably read comics like this before, assuming you read comics pretty regularly. Then again, if you don't read comics, what are you doing watching this channel? Anyway, this is a moment where the words we're observing may not have any immediate relevance to the visuals, but they are contributing something overall to the form, the narrative, the structure, the thesis, whatever. And then finally is the montage, where words are treated as an integral part of the pictures. This is kind of similar to non sequitur, which, if you don't remember in terms of panel structures, it's where you've got a bunch of random WTF images arranged in no seemingly comprehensible order. So it is sort of likewise with here. Words are just sort of created as part of the background noise of whatever's taking place with the characters, the idea, the argument, what have you. So we can see there sort of 6 solid sort of dissections of how words and pictures are specifically arranged in comics. And that's really important to talk about because looking at those structures, we can observe how artists, how writers, how thinkers are purposely trying to arrange their words and their images together to create meaning. And again, sometimes the absence of words can be truly profound in terms of the actual aesthetic message coming across. There's really not too much more to say. The last parts of Chapter 6 are him basically providing an example of a young woman who goes out to get some ice cream in the rain, gets hit on by the guy behind the cashier's clerk, she comes home and she eats the ice cream. And he basically sits down and shows how you could basically take the same 6-panel structure and using different creative choices tell an entirely different story. Again, we have to remember that words by themselves, it falls upon the reader to create the images. Images by themselves, it comes upon the reader to think up the words. When you arrange words and images together, the artist has to pay attention to how they're creating the visuals, because if they do the wrong visual with the wrong set of words, they may completely ruin what they're trying to convey, or in some certain circumstances, they might actually, make it work pretty well. So, sort of in summation, Chapter 6 is really just this beautiful notion of the way we as a species have taken image and words and at times combined them into the sort of same functional unit, but then at the same time turned our back on the notion that an abstract expression can work alongside a picture. And again, it may not seem terribly important from afar, but when we consider comics, the way we experience words and images together can create the entire experience in and of itself. If, of course, I had to take the bookmark out. Again, looking at Ozymandias here, you don't have to know what he says when he screams out, "I did it." But seeing the phrase, "I did it," creates an entirely different effect upon the reader, because hopefully at this moment you should feel a sense of horror upon that declaration. But even if you don't have those words, is the experience, or does the experience have the same effect on you? Food for thought. Well, I think that's it. I don't want to take too much more of your time. Thank you, as always, so much for watching. I really appreciate it. Don't forget, as always, if you want to check out Understanding Comics, hit up your local comic book shop. They probably have an issue of it. If they do not, ask to see if they could order one for you. And again, if they can't, don't forget to check out your local public library, because they probably have this, or they can get it to you through interlibrary loan. As always, as well, I'll make sure to post a link to Scott McCloud's website as well as his TED Talk, because it's just an excellent TED Talk, and it's another reminder of how comics can be really interesting as a medium. Also, don't forget, please like, share, subscribe, all that jazz. It helps me out a lot. It helps me know that you're watching, that you're liking this, or that you had 30 seconds to kill and you like looking at my curly mess of a hair. It's actually clean for once. And again, I've said it over and over and over again. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. Go read some comics.